Hi and welcome back. Now we're going to take a look at the XP constraints object. Now XP constraints, and if we add one here, we can see that this is it's a dynamic object and it has a bunch of tabs. We have connections, which is probably the main one to start with. We have collisions, forces, viscosity, friction, surface tension. And then we've got the usual things like groups affected and fall off. The main thing to know about constraints is that it's a particle-to-particle constraint, or a spring. It's a spring in the sense that it connects those two particles and then it has a force between them. And it'll either keep them in tension or repulsion. You can have it where it keeps them rigidly connected. And the more of these connections you have, the more rigid the whole particle structure becomes. I think the best way is to demonstrate. Now, if I actually turn that back off, because I don't want it on just for the moment, and we'll just take a look at how our emitter's set up here. So if I just nudge it along one frame, all I'm doing here, and I find this is the best way to kind of test constraints and demonstrate them. So I've currently got an emitter, and we have it set to circle filled, and then it's a random gradient with a 2-color gradient. Now, if I press play now, you'll see it just collides with this surface and nothing particularly happens. It kind of looks like snow's just been dumped on it. But there's no collision between the particles, there's no dynamics going on, it's just classic XP, gravity, and collider. So to make this a lot more interesting, we could add in perhaps particle-to-particle collisions, make it look a bit like a physics sim, something or a dynamic sim that you'd see in C4D default. But with constraints, if I just nudge one frame on here, and actually let me change the display mode just quickly. So I actually have something called display constraints on here, and that'll become obvious what that is in a second. And then I nudge it along. And currently, there are no constraints being created because I need to actually activate them. And I'm going to choose connect at birth. Now these three here are the sort of the three main ways to connect your particles with the constraints. And I'm going to create a birth constraint. Oops, activate it. So it says connect at birth. Don't need to worry about this just yet. I'm going to press play. And you'll see now these yellow lines have appeared. And these yellow lines are the constraints. And I'm viewing those because I've got it active in the emitter, and I can turn them on and off. And let's go back to circle filled. Oop, yep, there we go. Press play, and now we have something very interesting happening. So that instead of the particles collapsing onto the floor, they're actually holding onto each other. And because there's multiple connections between each particle and then to another particles, the whole structure itself forms this kind of very realistic looking physical object. So you can imagine that this emitter is a cube of jelly or something like that, or jello, I think probably is the American term for that. And each of these is a molecule inside that jello, or we're not thinking of that in the same kind of high resolution, but it's the same principle. That the molecules in those are attracted to each other, and they allow each other to stretch, and those connections allow to stretch, and then they kind of spring back. And that's exactly the same principle here, as we're just at a lower or a higher granularity, or a lower granularity, I should say. And you can see here, it actually keeps together almost like a sheet, but it is kind of collapsing. So the shape is actually collapsing. And whilst we're on the subject here of this sort of shape and collapsing and stuff, it's quite hard to see the general shape of this. It's cubic, but it's actually kind of flat in the viewport, if you like. There's one way we can kind of see the divisions between the particles, and we could draw the outlines. But that performance-wise becomes very heavy, and you can see that's quite heavy. It's not too bad there, actually. But if you add more particles, it gets very heavy. A little trick I use is I actually use the SSAO, and I actually activate that in the options here in the viewport. And that just gives you this sort of ambient occlusion between the particles. And it's a really handy thing just to kind of see how the shape of this object is, and just kind of get a better separation between the particles. But like I said, it's collapsing, so we don't want it to collapse quite as much. So what we want to do is we want to have the particles actually collide with each other, and you actually want them to be able to not collapse into each other. So here we have this collisions tab, and we have this basic collision here. And immediately we see something very interesting happening. And you can see this, it's breaking apart. It's keeping its structure a bit more. But when we get to this point, it's actually, the particles have nowhere to go, so they have to, there's an extreme force in the center there that actually tears them apart. And let's have a look at what is exactly is going on there. So if I press play and I nudge it on, you can see all these connections going on here. Well, by default, you have 8 of them. And in fact, do you know what? I'm actually going to go back to a simpler setup just so that we can really drive home how this is going to work. So I'm going to make it a rectangle. I'm going to put it up here. I'm just going to omit 1 frame. And then I'm going to draw, because I think this is the best way to explain this. So doodle object, and let's choose a color that we can see. Okay, so we can see, say we're looking at this particle here. This particle will look to the constraint object for some instructions or modify the particles. And what it's doing is we're saying that at birth, which is literally when it appears, when it first is birthed into the scene, make some connections. And the connection limit is 8. So from this particle here, it's going to go off and it's going to go, okay, right, looking around my neighbors, I'm going to make a connection. 1, 2, 3, and there's one all the way across there, look. And there's one to this one, until we reach that maximum number of 8. And just to say that these connections might be the opposite direction, by the way, and that particle will then jump to another, it'll look for another particle. Like, for instance, this one's jumped all the way down to here, this one's jumped all the way across over here, and so on. And what these are springs. So you can think of these as springs that have a certain sort of strength value. And the stiffness of these springs is how much the structure will be springy or bouncy or rigid. But what we can do is we can also create a break. We can create a break we can cause it to break. So we'll have a look at that in a second. But if I change my color of my pen, I can also talk about some of these other settings. So obviously we have weight, which is a global thing. Don't worry about that too much. You don't need to worry about that. That's how it kind of blends with these other things. So it's how it blends with the forces and the friction and the surface tension. No need to worry about that. We don't tend to do much weight mixing in general. But we do have these other ones we can take a look at. So we'll forget polygon edges and polygon diag, and we might come back to those in a minute. That's kind of a way to create a cloth effect. But the main ones here are the stiffness. So the stiffness is the strength between things. So if I actually go back to our view, let's go back to our other emitter and press play. Now the stiffness, and I'm actually going to not have it break so that you'll see what happens. So there we go, it holds together, you see. The stiffness is how rigid the structure will maintain. And you can see how it essentially does relate to how much resistance this has to compressing. So you can see here it kind of doesn't compress quite as much, but if I reduce it, it'll allow them to compress, and in fact it kind of behaves more like a fabric at that point. And the best way to kind of approximate this in the real world would be to look at different densities of objects. So like a sponge would compress quite a bit. A stone obviously is not going to compress at all, but a dense rubber ball is actually going to compress a little bit, but it's going to spring right back out. So the stiffness is still quite high. So you can see here, I can increase the stiffness to 100%. And then I can also increase the connection limit. Now the connection limit is how many of those connections, like I was drawing a minute ago, how many of them can form. Now the more that can form and the more connections that can be made, the stiffer the object will be. With one caveat here, it's limited by this radius. So within this radius, if it finds 15 connections or less, it will maximize out those connections. If I increase the radius, it'll enable it to connect to particles all the way over the other side, and it'll create a much more rigid structure. Although, to be honest, it's not particularly... There we go. Let's see if I go really high. Can you see how it's springing? And you can see there's loads more connections between all of these. Another thing to note is the X particles, as with the collisions in X particles, if I press Ctrl D, subframe steps are very important. So if I drop the subframe steps down, it completely changes the look of the simulation. And that's because there's not enough subframe steps for the simulation to solve itself, and the accuracy reduces. So I'm going to go up to 10, which will be very much slower, but you can see that's made my object almost completely incompressible. Still very springy, and perhaps we could use friction on the floor and things to mitigate that. But you can see how much more rigid that structure is, and now that we've got more subframe steps. If I drop the connection limit back down again, it'll be a bit more flexible. But you can start to see you can have real fun with this. And I could definitely play with it too much. And you can see as I'm reducing the connection limit, the springiness or the overall springiness is actually going down. The stiffness at 80 is kind of default, seems to be quite good. And then I could drop the radius down and you'll find it's a bit more flexible again. There we go. Now, what we were seeing earlier, we were actually seeing the springs break. So we're actually seeing them, the constraints actually break away and the object splitting in half. And I'm going to set it back to relative connected, which is the default. And we have this break value, which is 50. So as I press play, oh, we're not seeing any breaking. And that's probably because we've increased the subframe steps. But if we go back here and go to 3, we can see that it actually splits. More subframe steps, like I said, is more accurate, but at the same time can take more time. So you need to find a balance between all of these settings. Always look out for your subframe steps. But I'm pretty happy with 3, that seems fine. And it's allowing the particles to break apart. Now what's happening here? Let's go back to our other emitter so I can do a little demonstration again. What's happening with this break value here, it says relative connected, and this break as value, what this is saying is when it's connected, let me get the doodle object out. When the connection is made, let's use a yellow so it's the same as the constraints. When this connection is formed, this length, so L, this length here between these two particles is the relative connected length, right? So if these were spaced out more, it would be higher. And then the break value allows it to expand to an extra 50%. So it would be, if this expanded a little bit more, so that would be 0.5 L, which is 50% extra. Let's just write the 50%. That at this point, this is when you'll break the connection. This is when the whole thing will break and you'll separate, and you'll see them just vanish when we go back into this angle here. So if I go frame by frame, we'll actually see some of our connections breaking apart. No, that's not very clear actually. Let's make it a thin. Let's make it a thin emitter. That'll be much easier to see. Make sure we actually emit some particles though. That's usually useful. Okay, pausing it just at the moment of break. Although, of course, it doesn't break when I want it to. So what I can do is I can say lower the break value so it'll break easier. There we go. And you can see these no longer have a constraint between each other. It's completely broken. Hence why it's allowed to sort of break and fall down to the floor. And you can increase this break value until you're kind of happy with it. You want it to kind of grab on a little bit more. You can see actually some of them break, but there's enough still maintained that it sticks together. And you can see we're also almost getting some kind of cloth simulation right there. Let's go back to a thicker, more interesting looking one. There we go, it breaks apart into a sort of mushy pile, which is kind of interesting. And the other modes here, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but they're just allow you to set a based on this radius here instead of the spacing that they were emitted at. This break value is a percentage of the relative radius rather than the actual thing. So I can have it go really low down. I have to go really low to get this one to break. Oh, it's not even wanting to. Or maybe it's higher actually. Is it higher? I think it's too strong. The connection is actually too strong, and we need to drop down the connections there. Oh, struggling to make connections. There we go. 30. And there we go. So we can also do an absolute value. So anything that expands beyond, any spring or constraint that expands beyond 35 will break apart. What about 10? 20? Ah, it's below the radius value, so it's never gonna. Let's go break above 30. There we go. So yep, well worth playing with the break values. They're really good fun. And the stiffness can be mapped to other things like a temperature, radius, that kind of thing. So you can create some really interesting melting effects. I'm not going to go into that in this one, but yeah, there's quite a few possibilities with that. So that's the connection by birth and also the breaking stuff. I've got another demo of the breaking actually. I could show you quickly. Oops, hide this system. Oh, I hide the system, but I do need to get rid of my collision objects, so I need to deactivate those as well. Let's go into breaking, turn this on, and what have I got here? I've got these two things here. So what I've got is let me play actually, it's quite interesting. So you can see here, I've actually connected these two cubes up. I've got a bit of animation on this cube. And what I'm doing is I'm actually connecting on collision. We've done this before where we actually connect the particles on collision. And so I'm sticking them, but they also have constraints active. And it's a distance-based constraint. Actually, we don't even need distance-based on this one. There we go. You can see them twisting and connecting. Now, if I play with this break value, so if I relative connected, and I go lower and lower, eventually at the point they'll snap apart, you see? So they actually break away from the object. And this is a lot of fun, like I said, and you can create some very interesting things when you mesh these or drive some geometry with them. I'm going to turn that off again. Go back to our other one. So I managed to hide everything and unhide everything. There we go. And let's just go back to where we were before. Oh, what have I gone wrong here? Constraints. I think my break value might be incorrect here. So let's just... Oh, is that the absolute break value? So none. And we need to increase the radius to 40. Oh, my colliders are off. That would be probably the main issue. Didn't catch that one. There we go. Okay, so you can see here we can create some very interesting looking, almost jello or jelly objects, and it's very physically realistic. But it's about how you're going to apply that. You could use this in motion design, of course. You could mesh this. You could, have it deform polygons and things like that. But there are all sorts of different kinds of constraints. So we've got the birth one. That was literally any particle that's born will create a constraint. Whereas we can also do one which is based on distance. So if I disable our connect at birth constraint, and our constraints are now formed by distance. Now, when I emit like this, it doesn't look much different because the constraints are all within the correct distance from each other. So if I actually make the spacing in the emission, in our hexagonal emission, much higher, like that, we can actually see these constraints forming. And if I reduce the radius down, you can see here that the constraints won't form until I hit a certain value. Oops, I should animate that value up, or at least move it whilst it's animating. You can see there's no connections until they come in within a value. And as you can see, as I'm increasing, more connections are being made. Now, the advantage of this one over the birth one is that you can animate up, or you can bring other particles into the system. So if I grab another emitter, put him over here. Just so he's nearby. And I press play. Let's hope this other one falls over the right side. There we go. Now, these two things will now be connecting. So if I'd just done a birth one, they would stay separate. But now they're one unified sort of clustered constrained system. So let's just demonstrate that with the birth one. Make sure there's no breaking. We need to probably match the 37, so it's 40. Oh, that's fine. Move that emitter over there. And you'll see they kind of mush into each other and they don't actually constrain against each other. Whereas with distance, if I activated distance, they're going to connect to each other and constrain and resist each other. Started pirouetting off. Quite a lot of energy going into that simulation, it looks like. Awesome. So that's the distance one. And like I said, you've got your connection limit stuff just like before with the birth one, and also stiffness values and stuff like that. So you can see I can compress it and it sort of expands as well. And there are breaking values here. The breaking value is just is based on the distance because there's no relative connected stuff. It's just based on the connection. Okay, that is the distance one. Now let's take a look at the custom constraints. Now this one's interesting. I don't tend to use this that much, but it allows you to create almost your own birth or distance one. You can combine these to make a really interesting sort of different properties in different objects. And what I mean by that is like, so you've got something that expands. Say it's like a foam that has or a sponge that actually absorbs liquid, it can change and it can press differently over time, or it can and that kind of stuff. So I've actually got a preset, not a preset, but I've created a. Let me just make sure this is all off. I could use layers to do this quicker, but it's fine. So what do we have in this one called custom? So I should probably have some kind of collider, and I've got this colliding box down here. If I open it up, and I can turn off the collisions, and I press play, what have we got? So, this is looking pretty interesting. And this is a custom constraints going on right now. Like, we've got no birth and nothing like that. And what you can see here is the weights. In fact, that's all pretty much default at the moment. What we can do is if we have the usual stuff, the weights, the connection limits, and the radius. But then we also have these two separated parameters, compression and expansion. And that is literally how much the constraint will compress or how much it will expand. And you can kind of balance those two out. So if I actually reduce the compression down, this will sort of mush around a lot more, and you can see they can roll around each other a bit more. You get quite a different looking simulation. If I increase the compression, it's a bit more stable actually, and you get interesting things going on there. And if I drop the expansion down, I imagine it'll, bit more exploding. And you can also have breaking values here again. You can increase the rate of expansion, rate of compression, that kind of stuff. This one's, I find, I use mostly the birth and distance ones for connecting them and constraints. But this one allows you some much, much finer control of those things. And I'm not going to go into too much more detail. Plastic just means that when it gets to beyond a certain level of the constraint gets past a certain, look at this. By the way, can you notice there's lots of energy in this simulation? A bit overzealous. But it gives you some excellent looking stuff. Anyway, the plastic is when the constraint gets beyond a certain value, it doesn't break, but it no longer becomes effective. So it doesn't snap away or anything. It becomes defunct as a spring. So there's no more, it doesn't compress, it doesn't pull them together. It just becomes a constraint between them, and it won't pull them together anymore. So that's really cool. So yeah, that's custom, bit of a weird one. Create some absolutely fascinating sort of simulations with that. And let's look at forces next. So let's turn off our collider and hide it. Forces, and this one's a good fun one. So I'm just going to turn off the constraints for a minute. Press play just so we see what we've got. I've got a regular emission of particles, different radii, and then I've got the constraints object. I've got collisions active, and then if I look at the other tabs, they're all deactivated, apart from forces. Now, forces, as it sounds, creates it's a constraint between the particles. It's a spring, but it's actually more of a. It doesn't hold them together. It's just an attractive or repulsive force between the particles. When I activate the constraints object, you'll see what I mean. And you'll see they start to attract towards each other. And they're bouncing around, but they're still free to roll around each other and move around. And you can see we actually end up at some sort of equilibrium here. And that's really cool. And I could increase the repulsion so they actually push each other away more. So as they get closer to each other, they repel. And you could actually probably balance them out perfectly so they end up just complete perfect equilibrium. You see that's kind of collapsing in on itself? It's kind of fascinating. And then we have the attraction value. The attraction value is very, very low because as they get closer to each other, it increases because I've got it set to a linear fall off. And also the radius that I'm setting here is actually quite high. So if I reduce the radius down too low, they're never going to attract to each other. If I go 30, that's still too low. 40, 50. Oh, it does need to be 100 then. I'm just going to quickly throw in a sphere so we can see the radius, right? So that radius is of radius of 100. And you can see it's just not going to be enough to attract the ones next to it. So it does need to be 100 minimum. You see, they start to attract to each other. And of course, these constraints, as they form, these attractions and repulsion forces, the more particles are in one area, the more of these forces there are, because obviously each one has its own force. But you can limit that, like you can limit the connections here. And the more of these there are, the quicker the thing will solve. But you might need more subframe steps as usual. So yeah, that's attractive forces, and this is really useful for, you might not just, you could kind of create a planetary system using this, and you can map these values to, say, like a radius. So I could say I could map the radius. I've actually already got it sort of somewhat set up, where the larger particles will be more attractive than the smaller particles. And you can see here the smaller particles have much less attraction, and they end up sort of stuck in the middle of nowhere. Sort of almost like a Newtonian gravity, but not quite. So that's really cool. So you can see they're not actually making any connections. Now we could combine this with distance, for instance, and when they come within distance, they will connect. Let's just make sure our constraints are showing. And we can see that nice and clearly here. So you see as they get closer and closer, a constraint is formed, and it won't be allowed to actually get close to each other. But there's energy being put into the system, of course, because we've got an attractive force going on. And see, that's really cool. And then you could animate this so that the forces could then switch over, and you could have a much stronger repulsive force. So like you could have it low to start with, and then increase it over time, and you'll start to see it trying to expand. And then obviously it'll fight to the point where it will break. So I've got the repulsion a bit too high there. Lower it down, animate it back up, starts to fidget until it sort of smashes apart. Yeah, really awesome. That'd be really good for some kind of molecular thing. By the way, I'm really interested in the geometry that creates. So a geometric shape at the beginning because of the grid. Very cool. All right, so that's the attractive forces, or the forces in the constraint object. Let's take a look at the next one, which we've got here. We've got viscosity. Now, viscosity is more related to how things connect to each other I'm going to actually use our original simulation for this one. Let's turn that off. Turn our colliders back on. All right, so how are we going to look at viscosity? Well, first up, we're going to obviously have to enable it. So in the constraints object, we'll go to the viscosity tab and enable it. And then I'm going to make sure that all our other connections are turned off. So turn off distance. I'm going to leave collisions on. And if I press play, let's just see what we get. And you can see it kind of nullifies our collisions, but the viscosity is dealing with how the particles interact with each other. It's kind of a friction thing. So it actually becomes somewhat like a liquid sim or a fluid sim. Let me go back to having no spacing between our particles, so we've got more of them. And you can see the connections are made, but they're not holding it together. They're just sort of dragging out until they actually break and snap. There's never really a rigid connection between them, but you can get these kind of gooey liquid kind of simulations out of it without even using any of the other simulation tools, which is really cool. So if I make it bigger, still got some spring to it. That's all in the collision. And then it kind of spreads out. And then obviously if we increase the viscosity, it's going to stick together more, because viscosity in real life, it's talking about sort of how sticky or stiff a liquid is. And how, say you've got a comparison, like water would be your baseline. That's very low viscosity, and it'll fill the shape of the container it's in. Whereas a high viscosity with something like a really thick paint or honey or something like that will actually it'll hold its shape for a lot longer, and it'll actually pile on top of each other and slowly move around itself. So if I increase the connection limit, it'll increase the viscosity. And you can see that it kind of sticks to itself. It's sort of just slowly, eventually will just drag down. And obviously you can change the stiffness of this and the radius like all the other ones. This part of the constraints object is usually best to combine with the other fluid simulations. I find that's where it's best. So if you need to add some viscosity to a PBD simulation, you can use this, use the constraints as a sort of a more advanced way of controlling things. But yeah, it's very useful to have in there. Next up, we have friction. Now, friction in a similar fashion is sort of best used with other modes. But you can see without friction, everything's going to sort of bounce away and just escape. With friction, the actual particles have an influence on each other, and they actually will stop each other from moving around each other very fast. So I actually use this as a sort of dampening system. And if I go and turn that off, and we just go to, say we go back to birth connections, or birth constraints, and there we go. Let's have it so it actually breaks quite low. There we go. Can you see how it's jittering around everywhere? Let's make it a bit bigger, actually. There we go. So if you look at this simulation now, and I zoom in a bit, you can see it's kind of bobbing around and jittering around. Well, if we want to kind of dampen that sort of bouncing everywhere, actually, tell you what, the custom constraint probably had the biggest bounce to it, didn't it? So yeah, see how this is jittering like crazy? Well, let's have it break as well. So break. This has a lot of energy in it, and it kind of keeps jittering around the place. Well, if we add some friction, so we go to the friction tab, turn that on, you'll see the whole simulation starts to slow down, and it has a much more strict kind of, or controlled braking and movement. And you can tweak these settings. The overall friction setting is probably the most useful one here. But you also have static friction and kinetic friction. So it depends if they're moving around each other. You can kind of balance these two out, and you end up. So if they're moving, you can have higher friction. So you can actually probably simulate something like, and I'm guessing here, but I can imagine you can simulate something like a Newtonian fluid, where the more kinetic energy that's applied to it, the higher the friction is. So if something hits it really fast, the friction is higher. But if it's slowly moving slowly through it, you'll be able to push through it easily. But I'm guessing there. I'm just yeah, well worth experimenting with these things. So yeah, that's the friction one, and like I said, I use that all the time as sort of a dampening parameter to stop things from flying around all over the place without having to go crazy on the substeps. Oh, I think we've got viscous. Oh no, we've got friction on still. Okay, this is another one. So by the way, with all of these, I've been keeping collisions on, because if you don't have collisions on, it still works, but the simulation is going to be much more basic. You can see that it doesn't sort of shift around, and there we go. Keeps its volume, makes it much more realistic. So in general, I would keep collisions on, whether it be in the constraints object, where they're kind of simpler, or we can use the particle-to-particle constraints, which have a few more advanced settings on them. Okay, so what else have we got here? We've got surface tension. So I'm going to leave the constraints on again, and I'm just going to turn this on. And what surface tension is it's a constraint on the surface of the fluid. So X particles works out what particles are on the surface, and it brings them together. It keeps them in tension. And tension is just attraction and repulsion. It just keeps them in this balance. And what that causes is kind of like a balloon-like effect. So when a water drop hits the ground, or hits the surface, where it's not absorbed into the surface, it actually sits on top of it in a bead, and that's surface tension causing that. And also when you've got drops forming and falling out of the air, instead of it just turning to steam, or just turning into a mist, it actually keeps the water together by these forces on the outside of it, and it kind of keeps it in tension. It's best. I've actually got a setup for this one specifically, because it's much clearer. Let's open this one up. Let's hide all these. And what do we have here? So let me turn the collision box back on. And press play. And what have we got here? We've got 3 emitters. And let me turn the dynamics off, actually, just so we can see what's going on. So we've got 3 emitters. They're in regular mode, doing the usual thing. 1 shot emission and the radius of 10. And then I've got a gravity modifier, and then this constraints object. Now the constraints object has no connections being made. It has collisions on, and it just has friction and surface tension. So I've got friction to dampen it, which I'm going to turn off just now. And let's turn on the whole thing. And you'll see that the surface, they start to attract to each other. And if you'll notice, they don't keep each other separate. They actually absorb each other, or merge with each other, which is kind of a thing you'll see in surface tension, where surface tension is in a liquid. So when another of the same liquid comes close to it, it actually sort of absorbs it. And you can see that here, and it becomes all one mass. In fact, if I actually make the particle colors all the same, I'm just going to copy this gradient across. Let's see if that worked on both of them. Yes, it did. You can see it's a bit more clear that becomes one mass. And I can increase the surface tension by increasing the number of constraints or springs. And also I can increase the tension here or decrease it. There we go. And you can see it's jiggling around, and that's a perfect use case for the friction, where I'm going to add a bit of friction in there just to dampen things down. I don't want to kill the energy too much because it's kind of cool at the moment. There we go. And you can see actually one bead actually stayed up top because it resisted. And if I go frame by frame, you'll see when this hits, it actually kind of elongates. This is very much like how the liquid sims will be working. And can you see how it turns into a drop? Because it's still the tension is still there with this one, and then it separates and then rejoins the stuff down below. And then you've got this bead on the floor, and they're sort of sliding around like they would on a hot pan. Awesome. So all of these things look more interesting when you've got more particles. Let's push it a little bit. There we go. And we've sort of created, just with two simple things in the constraints modifier, we've just simply got friction, surface tension, and collision. And that's just how simple that is. And we've almost created our own little fluid simulation, which technically it is. So it's excellent. And you can customize these to no end. Let's just make this a little bit bigger. And you can see on the way down there, this one here over here, if I make it even bigger than that. Let's see if it collides with the... I've got it outside the collider, but the collider... So you can see here, it actually merges with the other one. Sorry, I'm just positioning my emitters to look a bit more interesting. Press play, and you'll see there's points where the other thing, the surface, actually binds with the other one. Pause there. Oh, no, missed the pause. And there you go. The fluid sort of collapses in on itself. The more iterations, as before, will create a more stable sim, but it'll slow everything down. So if you're doing, this would be really great actually for doing very detailed drops in a simulation. That'd be kind of fun. But I think PBD would be the better solution overall. All right, so I think that's it for the constraints object. We've got a couple of other things. We've got fall off. So I can do linear if I just do the usual demonstration where I kind of have a linear fall off. All this is doing is it's going to put the constraints into a specific area where one side will actually have constraints. So that's on the right-hand side here. And the left-hand side doesn't. And you can see the difference there. All right, so that's actually it for the constraints object. Like I said, there's always more to talk about in these objects, and it's more about how you combine them with other stuff. And I will probably be bringing this into some of the fluid sim stuff later on. But for now, have at it. And oh, actually, before I'm going to go one more thing, which is how you can actually render constraints. And I should have said that before, actually. Before we move on, let's have a look at one of these again. Turn this off and turn this off. Yes, because you can actually render these objects with a trail object. Sorry, the connections with a trail object. So if I go to our constraints object, let's make sure we're not on surface tension, and let's go for connect at birth. And you can see the yellow connections here. Well, if I was to put an XP material on all of this, onto this emitter, it won't render the connections. So if I press render, oh, nothing will happen, probably because I need to add an X particles. There we go. I was in hardware mode actually. And there we go, we can see that there's no actual connections being rendered here, and it's just sort of adding on all this rendering. Let's add a trail object. Throw it in the generators, and let's put the material on that. And then we need to, so if I leave that at default, obviously it'll just trail, which is still quite interesting. But it won't actually show us our connections. So I'm going to go to thickness and color. Set from value. Just make sure it's thin enough. And then now I'm going to go back to the trail object, general, and then I'm going to go to this mode down here. And that's called constraints. And you have an option to filter these constraints because you might have a trail object that has multiple constraints involved. We're just dealing with birth constraints, so I'm going to turn that on. And there we go, we get this interesting looking lattice. And I can render that here. So there's some really cool opportunities for rendering and making things look really cool by rendering the constraints themselves. Okay, so that definitely wraps up our constraint section. And next up, I think we're going to be looking at one of the fluid sims, which is where it gets really, really cool. And I think probably one of the effects ones. All right, catch you in the next one.